Hey, Mission Viejo and Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, one of my son's favorite cities in the world. Um, New Jersey, you already voted. Good for you. Loveland, Colorado, Mississippi. And all of a sudden, here we go, Maryland. My my comments have frozen, so things are a little bit difficult. Oh, wait, here we have Sugarland, Texas coming in from Facebook. So it looks like Facebook is on board. Somebody can confirm that. Hey, Sue, by the way. Oh, there we go. Globe, Arizona on Facebook. Hi, Janice, and we're ready to go. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm very excited today to get to talk to my friend, David Daley. You know Dave's work, even if you don't know that you know Dave's work, because he was really the person first to put on our radar screens the importance of partisan gerrymandering after the 2010 election with Operation Red Map. And that was in his first book called Rat Effed, which is reference to a term that was actually used by Republicans during Richard M. Nixon's administration, but which we can't now say on social media because we'll get hit by algorithms that will suppress us. So we all kind of dance around it. And he is now the author of a new book called Anti-Democratic: Inside the Far Right's 50-Year Plot to Control American Elections. And what Dave brings to the table better than virtually anybody else is not only he's a great writer, but also he's got a really broad vision that says, there's a deeper story here and there's a long-term story here. And I have to say his vision in that is really unparalleled, I think, compared to anybody else's. He used to be my editor and always could say, here's the story you want to cover. And I would say, nah, it's not really a story. And it would turn out to be the story. So first in Rat Effed and then in Anti-Democratic, he's got this really broad, important picture of what has happened in American politics over the last 50 years. So welcome aboard, Dave.
Thank you, my friend. It's an honor to be here.
Well, so can we start with Rat Effed and the whole issue of redistricting? Because what you have really delved into is the importance of redistricting and the importance of voter suppression. So why don't we start, if that's a good place for you to start, take it away and tell us what we need to know about those things along with their history.
Sounds like a great place to start. Rat Effed really begins in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama and that Democratic supermajority in the U.S. Senate. And everybody believed that the Obama coalition represented this ascendant American movement, right? That this was a generational coalition that was being put together. You had Democrats, you had Republicans, all of whom believed that Democrats were going to be in power for some time to come. And that's not exactly what happened, right? And it's because a handful of Republican strategists understood something really important. They understood that while the 2008 election was historic, the 2010 election could be more consequential. Because what do we do in years that end in zero? We do the census, and what follows the census is redistricting. And what these Republicans understood was that if they could win state legislatures in the 2010 election, they would have the ability to go ahead and remap all of those state legislatures, but also the fact that all of those state legislatures do Congress. So often in American politics, it's the lower level that sets the rules for the next level up. Republicans have had this long-term understanding that that's how it worked. In 2010, they went about trying to conquer state legislatures in order to control redistricting and Congress. This has remade American politics. If you live in North Carolina or Wisconsin or Ohio, you know all too well that your state is barely a democracy right now. But this has also done so much to give Republicans a leg up in the fight for Congress. And we're watching right now as they're trying to solidify that ahead of the 2026 midterms.
So just to be clear, when they went after the control of state legislatures in 2010, it worked.
100% it worked. They only had to win 107 specific state legislative seats across 16 states. So we're talking about Pennsylvania, Indiana, Ohio,
I'm
Michigan.
sorry, you said
Wisconsin.
110? How many?
107 seats allowed them to pull this off.
107 seats. That was it.
That was all
107
it took.
seats. Wow.
Florida, Alabama, Texas, these crucial states, just by holding state legislatures, sometimes by a handful of members, allowed them the power to draw these lines that then locked themselves in these state legislatures, but then also allowed them to draw the congressional delegations from all of these states. So when in 2012, the first election on these new maps, we re-elect Barack Obama. We add to the Democratic majority in the US Senate. Democratic candidates for the US House get 1.4 million more votes than Republicans. But Republicans hold the House. And it's not close. It's 234-201. And this is because largely of a redistricting. If you look at the handful of states that Obama carries statewide in 2012, he carries Virginia, he carries Ohio, he carries Florida, he carries Pennsylvania, Michigan. You add up these crucial swing states, they've got 94 members of Congress. Republicans win 64 of the 94 seats from these swing states in 2012. That's the difference right there. If Democrats are able to go 50-50 in the states they carried, then Democrats hold the House, and Barack Obama's second term is completely different. Instead, because of redistricting, Barack Obama's second term effectively ended on the night he was reelected to it, because Republicans had this foresight and deviousness to go ahead and draw these lines in a way that they could not lose, even when the other side got more votes.
Okay, so first of all, I'm sitting here wondering why people weren't out in the streets then. I think we just weren't paying enough attention. But redistricting is still very much on the table. Do you want to walk it forward to where we are today?
Sure. Well, there was a really damaging Supreme Court decision back in 2019 that John Roberts wrote and handed down, a case from North Carolina, the Arucho case. And this arrived at a moment in which, activists around the country had won change in so many states, and independent commissions. And there were, really, there was a widespread sense in the federal judiciary, judges appointed by Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, that the courts had to do something about this. And John Roberts said no, and he indeed closed the courts to any possibility of doing this, called it a political issue. Well,
doing this, you mean ending partisan gerrymandering?
Yeah. So what happens in 2021 is everybody goes crazy because there is suddenly no incentive to fix this. What John Roberts did in that decision, I think about it sometimes as if you remember Ghostbusters, that scene where Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd are like, you don't want to turn off the containment packs. Because if you turn off the containment packs, all of the evil spirits are going to come rushing out. And once the federal courts were closed, it was open season on gerrymandering. So what we saw in 2021 was Democrats doing this where they could in Illinois and Maryland and Oregon, but Republicans really locking in Texas, in Florida, in Oklahoma, Utah, Tennessee, Indiana, Nebraska, Kansas, and ratcheting up their advantages there. Now, here we are in the middle of the decade. The House is 219-216 Republican. It's 3 seats. And we're on the
again is a reflection. That's also a reflection of that partisan gerrymandering. If we did not have partisan gerrymandering, it would be a Democratic House, right?
I think that's probably right. Certainly, if you look at if you look at North Carolina, for example, where the Republican state Supreme Court overturned a fair map ahead of the 2024 election, and it went from a 7-7 map. Republicans then drew a 10-3 map. Well, the difference between the two parties in the House right now, 3 seats. So that map that Republicans enacted quite carefully and deviously ahead of 2024, gave them the additional 3 seats that they needed to win the House. That wouldn't have happened otherwise. But we are in the middle right now of an unprecedented mid-decade partisan gerrymandering Armageddon. And it was started by President Trump, who calls up Texas and, essentially says, I'm afraid that I'm going to lose the midterms. My popularity numbers are dipping into the high 30s. I want you to give me 5 more seats in the House. And so Texas did this. Texas went ahead and did a mid-decade gerrymander. They redrew the state's congressional map over the summer. They added 5 more seats for the Republican Party. California is trying to counteract this. There will be a vote on Proposition 50 next week that would allow Democrats to do a gerrymander there that adds 5 seats in retaliation. The trouble is for Democrats that Republicans did not stop there. They have already gone on to Missouri. They fractured a historically black district in Kansas City into 3 pieces, all of which will be Republican districts. They have gone into North Carolina and taken an additional seat, turned what was already a gerrymander into a bigger one. They're talking about this right now in Ohio, where it looks like they will grab 2 more seats. Ron DeSantis in Florida has said anywhere from 3 to 5 seats are in play there. There's the possibility of 2 in Indiana. You could keep going into Kentucky, into New Hampshire. And then there's this additional case at the Supreme Court right now on racial gerrymandering, which, if it comes down, this is the Calais case out of Louisiana, which has to do with the constitutionality of majority minority seats in the U.S. House and using race to essentially protect voters of color in the South and ensure that they have a voice and representation. If the court comes down and says that this is unconstitutional and effectively shreds what's left of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, you could see next year additional Republican remapping in Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, South Carolina. Maybe you go back into Texas again. Stacey Abrams' group has suggested it could be as many as 19 seats that could be claimed there. So if you grab the 9 to 12 seats that they could grab through partisan gerrymandering, the additional 12 to 19 that could come out of the Calais case, add that onto the 3-seat advantage they already have, you begin to see how they are trying to steal the 2026 midterms before a single vote has been cast, simply by how lines are drawn.
What really jumps out to me is that if, in fact, the Supreme Court does get rid of the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in the Calais case, is that essentially we're looking at Reconstruction only on a national level. That is, the American South becomes firmly Republican in what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism, where theoretically there are elections, but we all know how they're going to come out. But that will enable the Republicans, the radical Republicans, to control the entire nation, not just their region. And I do want to get into your book, Anti-Democratic, as well. But I wonder if the bridge between the Rat Eft book and this material and Anti-Democratic is the question of what can Americans do about this partisan gerrymandering, because we know that Democrats don't like it, but neither do Republicans, that we actually would prefer not to have partisan gerrymandering. But what can we do to push back against it?
No, it's a great question. I think we need to be thinking about the big long-term structural fixes that we need in this nation. And I think that starts with a more proportional House. I think in many ways, the real problem here is that we have single member districts, a winner take all elections. And anytime you have single member districts, the map maker who draws the line are eventually determining outcomes. So there's a terrific bill. It's called the Fair Representation Act that Jamie Raskin and Don Beyer keep introducing in Congress that would create proportional representation in the House, larger multi-member districts, use ranked choice voting. All of a sudden, every single district in the nation becomes a swing seat. I've never voted in a meaningful congressional election. I don't know about you. Maybe you have. But I think we are at this point in this nation in which you only had 37 districts out of 435 in 2024 that were within 5 percentage points. When you wipe the ones in California, Texas, Ohio, North Carolina off the board, as has already happened in this cycle, we are down to even fewer. We're about to have as many competitive districts as we have competitive states in presidential elections. This is no way to run a democracy. And it is time for us, I think, to really think about the big picture structural changes that could try to bring about actual representative democracy again for all Americans in all states.
Well, so I 100% I'm on board with that. But so when you talk about the partisan redistricting, you really root it in the election of Barack Obama in 2008. But your more recent work talks about the fact that this is all part of a much longer project. And I think that's right. I hope we will be able to do this more than once so we can really dig deeper and deeper. But can you walk us through what really seems to have been, since the start, an attempt of a group of radical Republicans, because they're not normal, traditional Republicans, they are radicals trying to overturn American democracy, to get rid of the Voting Rights Act? That was really always central to their view of America. They wanted to stop the participation largely of racial minorities in the body politic. Can you walk us through that?
Absolutely. The key figure here through all of this, right, is the Chief Justice. It's John Roberts. And the story that I try to tell in Anti-Democratic is one that goes back about 5 decades. It starts in the late 60s. And it has to do with Republicans understanding that the nation was going in a different way on Vietnam, on civil rights, on women's rights, on the environment, on the consumer movement, that it was a really dangerous moment for Republicans, and they believed that they were losing control. Rural conservative whites believed that they were about to be outnumbered. And they strategized in really important ways. This book begins with the Powell memo, written by Lewis Powell, a prominent Virginia lawyer for the Chamber of Commerce, in which he argues that the place that the American right needs to be organized to win is in the courts, that represents the clearest path to blocking a rise of new voices, a rise of voters demanding equality and multiracial democracy. Powell writes this memo, and about 2 months later, he is actually appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. He hands down a series of decisions in the 1970s on campaign finance that directly lead to the Citizens United case in 2010. But Republicans effectively understand throughout the 70s into the 80s that they need to build a conservative legal movement, and that this movement could be a future blockade on small d democratic elections in this country. John Roberts is an early foot soldier in this. John Roberts is in the Reagan White House and the Reagan Department of Justice in the early 1980s, when the Voting Rights Act reauthorization comes up in the early 1980s. And there's this big question in that case, which was essentially, does the Voting Rights Act stop? Do you have to show that there's racial intent in order to stop a voting law? Or can you simply show that there's a racial effect, a result? And Roberts says, well, you have to show intent. And that's pretty much impossible. To get into the hearts and minds and prove that in a courtroom is extraordinarily difficult. And that standard had frozen all Voting Rights Act enforcement across the country until Congress says, no, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do the results standard. But Roberts winds up on the Supreme Court, where even though he loses that fight in the early 1980s, he's been winning it as Chief Justice, because Republicans, through the Federalist Society, through the work of Leonard Leo, have been so focused on the courts in a way I would suggest that the Democrats have not been. And they have been able to consolidate their power. If you look at where this nation was when Roberts is placed on the court in 2005 versus where it is 20 years later on abortion rights, on gun rights, on campaign finance, on voting rights, on the regulatory state, about whether or not the president can be a king, the nation has been shifted dramatically to the right. John Roberts, in so many ways, is hardly just Chief Justice. It doesn't do him, any justice to simply say that's his role. He has been, in so many ways, the most effective Republican politician and political operative, perhaps of our lifetime, based on where he has been able to push the country. And so much of it is through these two threads, right, of redistricting and also voting rights. And that if you can pass laws that make it possible in states to suppress voters, and if you also have a very difficult time getting those lawmakers out of office because they've drawn their own lines to entrench themselves, you've pretty much figured out both sides of the equation. So the work that John Roberts has done in Shelby County, in the Rucho case, and what's coming up next in the Calais case, this has in many ways been his life's work, and it has been extraordinarily successful and consequential.
Well, so let's lay that out in a timeline. So, in fact, what you just identified as being the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in the early 1980s, Congress said, yeah, we want to reauthorize that, and we care about not intent, where, as somebody said, you literally need to get a memo that says, I intend to suppress votes, which is much more difficult than saying, hey, look, all these people got cut out of the vote. That had to have been intentional, or if it wasn't intentional, you ought to want to change it for justice reasons. But in fact, during the Reagan administration, you did have Reagan's Attorney General Edwin Meese saying, we are going to put people into the courts to make sure that the Reagan Revolution cannot be overturned no matter what the will of the voters is. And if you lay out what you just did, the 20 years of John Roberts's time in the Chief Justice spot, from his beginning not liking the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act through 2010, which is going to give us Citizens United and come on, what's the other big one in 2010? We get the redistricting that you talked about. We get
Shelby County in 2013.
2013 is Shelby County.
The Rucho case in 2019.
And what does Rucho do?
Rucho is redistricting.
Redistricting, okay. In 20, you said 2019?
That's followed, I believe, in 2021 by the Brnovich case, which begins to shred Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
And Brnovich says we don't care about the outcome of unequal laws, only about the intent. So now we're up to 2021.
And now we see the Calais case. Well, I mean, I would add Trump versus United States in there as well, of course.
July of 2024, in which the Supreme Court under John Roberts basically said the executive branch, the president, the head of the executive branch, cannot be checked by either the courts or the Congress, which is dramatic. And now we've got Calais, which would give the Republicans permanent control of the House of Representatives. Do you want to characterize what that 20-year period looks like for democracy?
It's been a 20-year period in which John Roberts came into office saying he was going to be an umpire. He was going to be calling balls and strikes. John Roberts has two different strike zones, based on which party is at the plate. John Roberts has put his thumb on the scale for the Republican Party in every single one of these voting rights cases. They have been teed up and planted there by a conservative legal movement that all funded by the same people that go out and find the plaintiffs. They fund the organizations who create the cases. They fund the Washington litigators, the 7-figure legal fees to bring them. They fund the law schools and the law professors who write the friendly amicus briefs that they then put in front of lawyers who they handpicked and hand-selected for the federal bench in the U.S. Supreme Court. So in a case like Shelby County, every single step there was a closed circle. The same way in Citizens United.
Shelby County versus
right now in Calais.
Shelby County versus Holder, 2013. Walk us through. That was the first major assault on voting rights, on the Voting Rights Act. Can you walk us really quickly through what Shelby County was?
Absolutely. Shelby County is a case about preclearance, which is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. It said that the states and localities that had the worst record, that could no longer be trusted to go ahead and pass their own laws on this because of decades of stubborn resistance, they had to run anything they wanted to do to change procedures past the Department of Justice or a court in Washington, D.C. before they did it. This was the most crucial enforcement mechanism of the Voting Rights Act. It was governed by a formula that covered who was under it based on history and previous activity in those areas. It was, mostly states in the South, a handful of places elsewhere. And it was a crucial enforcement arm. Before preclearance, it just didn't matter, right? We had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution after Reconstruction. But because there was no enforcement arm until the Voting Rights Act and preclearance comes along, you get 100 years of Jim Crow. And it's preclearance that puts an end to that. And John Roberts, effectively overriding Congress, which back in 2006, when it reauthorized the Voting Rights Act nearly unanimously for 25 years, along with a 14,000-page record detailing exactly why Section 5 preclearance was still needed to this day, that it was not some relic of 1966, that these things were still happening and that this protection was still needed. John Roberts said no. He said that things have changed in the South. We have a black president now. Voter participation numbers have increased. We're going to declare victory and say that this is no longer needed. Except Roberts didn't make a full attack on it, right? He simply froze the formula. He said, well, if Congress wants to take this on, Congress could, knowing, of course, that Congress would not. So he neutered it. He pinned the Voting Rights Act and mounted it on the wall and allowed it to exist in name only. And this is what Roberts is so good at.
Yes.
He is so good at making up, and in this case, he absolutely makes up the law. He creates a statute, a doctrine of equal sovereignty among states that even conservative law professors look at and say, that doesn't exist. That's not a thing. He made it up. He planted it in an earlier case, and then he referred to himself. It doesn't exist. But even if it did, this is what Roberts is so good at. He is good at being stealthy. He's good at having this reputation still of being an institutionalist and a moderate and an umpire, even though he's had his thumb on the scale all of this time, right? I mean, these justices wear black robes. They ought to have to wear, blue and red robes, and those robes ought to be covered with, like it's a NASCAR race or something, with the, patches of their sponsors and the people who have, paid to put them there.
Well, so that's actually where I was hoping to go with this. And you're absolutely right. Roberts has been a master at hollowing out laws and hollowing them out and making them look as if they're still there, even though there's nothing left inside them. And this is one of the reasons the overturning of Roe versus Wade, I think, was such a surprise, and why it was so messy when it happened, because it really looked as if those who wanted to overturn it jammed him by leaking it to the press early on, because everybody who was watching him thought he was just going to hollow it out further. He wasn't directly going to overturn Roe v. Wade, recognizing that people would see that and actually step up and complain about it. So he's always been very good at hollowing those things out. But the direction that I was wondering if you would go is that, while there's no doubt that what Roberts and the other radicals on the court are doing is currently helping MAGA Republicans, what they're essentially doing is sidelining Congress, sidelining the voice of the American people, and putting in place what I think Roberts intended to be an oligarchy. You know, he was all for sort of the rich white guys running everything, but ended up instead with Donald Trump and what looks like an autocrat. And I just find this a really interesting moment, because while the court has 100% put that in place, we are a hair's breadth away from Trump deciding he doesn't need the Supreme Court either. And this is, I just think it's going to be interesting to see where Roberts takes this, with the idea that, they've created a monster, and it was a monster that, so long as the oligarchs were willing to nod to the Supreme Court and say, yes, we care deeply that you are putting us in place, and therefore we're going to protect you, was one thing. Now that you've got Trump saying it's my Supreme Court and they have to decide for me, what do they do? Do you have any ideas?
I think you're right. I think Roberts always imagined he'd have a dancing partner who looked a lot like him and thought a lot like him, and that they could, call the tune together. And instead, he has a Republican president who is, calling his own tune, and Roberts doesn't exactly know the beat. He's kept up pretty well, though. I would say that in most of these cases, the court continues to give Trump what it is that he wants. Yeah. On congressional spending, on the ability to, fire executive branch members that he does not like. The Reagan White House is also where this idea of the unitary executive theory begins.
With Samuel Alito, right?
Yes. So they very much believe in this idea of a king in the White House who has this kind of unitary power. This has been something that they have been working on in Federalist Society hothouses over the course of 4 decades, right? And so they have the unitary executive theory that gives Republican presidents maximal power. But then when there's a Democrat in power, you begin to hear about the major questions doctrine. And that's as well, all major political questions can't be decided by the president. If the president wants to go ahead and, do something about student loans, no, that has to be done by Congress, right? So, it's unitary executive for Republicans. It's major questions for Democrats. We'll see what happens if the major question becomes the future of American democracy in such a way that John Roberts can't duck it. But I think that there's been this, whether it's the opinion page of the New York Times or, so many other places, this idea that, boy, John Roberts is a sensible conservative. John Roberts at some point will step in and save us. Well, then do it already, buddy.
Yeah. No,
it hasn't happened yet. If it does, we'll be grateful. But until then, I think his track record suggests we ought to be skeptical that he understands the stakes.
So we're running long, and I'm going to let you go. I hope we can do this again, but I just want to call people's attention to the fact that, and David, maybe you can add to this, that one of the key fights of our era is to make sure people can vote. and to try and protect nonpartisan gerrymandering, the idea that you actually get to choose your leaders rather than they choose you. And there are those questions on the ballot in just a few days in November. So, turn out, get people to turn out with you. And David, what would you say that people should do?
Boy, we have to be really, a turnout, massive turnout is the one thing that can, maybe swamp these lines. These lines are drawn based on algorithms and programs and, previous elections and previous turnout. If those numbers increase, if they go up, then all of a sudden all bets are off. So absolutely vote, turnout, but we need to remember that this is a long-term fight. Republicans have been really, really good at enlisting in this at the local level and staying in the fight decade after decade, cycle after cycle. We need to do the same thing on this side. Those local elections, they matter. Everything builds up. We can't be involved only in presidential years. We have to be involved every single year. Donald Trump, we imagine, will be gone in 2028. This court will be here for some time. And so we are going to have to organize and be really, really effective and be thinking about how we fix and reform all of these institutions when we get into office again. And we will. I open Anti-Democratic with a John Roberts quote that I think we all ought to be aware of. And I'll end on that because I think we ought to have the last word on this and not John Roberts. What Roberts said on C-SPAN in 2009 is the most important thing for the public to understand is that we're not a political branch of government. They do not elect us if they do not like what we are doing. It's more or less just too bad. Let's tell him no way. Let's show up. Let's vote. Let's win.
Thank you so much, David. And I hope we can do this again. Best of luck with Anti-Democratic. But once again, your ability to look at the whole picture is just so unparalleled. And thank you for being here. Let's do it again.
I'm really, really grateful to be here and absolutely anytime, my friend. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And I'll talk to you soon. Take care.